Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about our PUSHFOLD module. The PUSHFOLD module computes strategies for pre-flop only games, which means situations in which either all but one players fold pre-flop or one or more players go all in and there's no post-flop play. There are currently two modes for 2 players and more than 2 players, which differ slightly, and I will go over an example of each, but we'll unify behavior across those 2 modes in the future. Let's start by looking at the 2-player case. This is applicable to heads-up sit-and-goes, of course, but also to the heads-up portion of any other sit-and-go or tournament. So going over these fields one by one, we have the number of players, blind level, let's go for 2040, awards, so all award structures are equivalent to 100-0 in heads-up. Then we set a raise size, we go for a min raise, and a re-raise size, we go for 180. And then we'll set stacks, we use symmetric stacks in this example, 500 chips each. And finally we have to choose hero position. We have 2 positions in heads up, which we call out of position and in position. So out of position has first to act and in position has second to act. And they differ by which strategy is available here. So let's have a look at these strategies. Out of position strategies consist of an initial action, a response to a re-raise, and a response to a reshove. Now recall, since these are pre-flop only games, we can't limp, since that might entail post-flop play. So we can fold, raise, or shove as our initial action. And when we raise, we also need to specify what we do against a re-raise and against a reshove. Right, so against a re-raise, again, we can call since we don't allow post-flop play, so we can either fold to a re-raise or shove over a re-raise, and against a reshove, we can only fold or call. Let's also look at in-position strategies real quick. So in-position strategies face a raise or a shove from the out-of-position player, and then need to decide how to play against that. So first, playing against an open shove, one can only fold or call. So essentially there's 2 variants of each of the other options. One which decides to fold to an open shove and one which decides to call open shove. And then we have to specify how we play against an open raise. We can either fold to the open raise, ending the hand, or we can re-raise the open raise, or we can shove over the open raise. So when we shove over the open raise, we're all in and it's done. But when we re-raise the open raiser may then re-shove over our re-raise, and then we again have to decide whether to fold or call. Okay, let's calculate an in-position strategy for hero. So we'll say hero is in position, and we will define an out-of-position strategy for the villain. So just for purposes of example here, we keep it simple. We'll say villain has an open shoving range, something like this. And then villain has a raise of call range, which is this. And now let's wait for a second and think about what we've done here so far. So we've essentially picked some hands that are strong pre-flop, but maybe not very strong post-flop, and said that villain will just open shove these. And then we've taken all the strongest hands, and here villain will raise these, possibly to induce a reshove, but of course shove over a re-raise and call a reshove, because these hands are very strong and villain wants to get all in with these. So now we need to assign a strategy to all these other hands here. So fold is the default, we don't explicitly to set that, so we just look at these options here. So we think that villain doesn't have any hands that he folds to a raise but calls a shove worth, so we're not going to use this line. But we will add some bluff raises here. So these are hands that villain raises but then folds if he gets re-raised or reshoved. So let's say a couple of weak blocker hands, maybe like this. And maybe some of these guys. And then next we'll think, okay, we'll have some hands that have pretty good all-in equity, and we're going to raise them, and we'll fold them to a reshove, but if we get re-raise, then we'll shove over that just in case, so we can't be exploited by bluff re-raises. And we'll go for the rest of these hands here. Okay, and now we hit calculate, and now what we get back here is the optimal counter strategy to this villain strategy that we put in here. So this strategy plays each starting hand in the most profitable way possible amongst the alternatives that we allow. Now, just to reiterate, what we're solving here is the restricted game where you have to go all in or fold pre-flop. You can't call, you can't go to post-flop play. But given that restriction, this is the best possible strategy for hero in position against an out-of-position villain who plays like this. So obviously the problem is knowing exactly how your villains play, and that's work you'll have to do. Now let's have a look at the output strategy. So the first thing we see is that a lot of hands are just being folded here, right, up to King 9 offsuit and Ace 3 offsuit. And that's because we gave villain an extremely strong range here. No card smaller than a 9, unless it's ace high or a pair, and basically all the broadways and all the premium hands. So that's really not too surprising. And then we see there are a few hands which are folded to raise but call an open shove. And again, that's because, if you look at the open shove range here, it's very exploitable, and ace 7, ace 6 are flipping or ahead enough of the time that it makes sense to call an open shove, but they're not ahead enough of the raising range to make it sensible to shove over a raise. Next, let's look at the reshoving range. So these green hands here, we see a couple of strong ace X's, a bunch of pairs of course, and then a lot of suited connected style hands that either have blockers or have good equity when called, since they'll not be dominated generally. Finally, let's look at the re-raising range. So we have two kinds of re-raising hands essentially, and the only way in which they differ is that some of these hands fold to an open shove, and some of these hands call an open shove. So it's all the strongest hands up here re-raise. None of them fold to a reshove, so they always re-raise call. But these hands here don't call an open shove, because again, if you look at the open shove range, they won't be ahead enough of the time. Okay, that's that for the output strategy. One thing I want to note is that the strategy style input and output format may be a little bit different from what you're used to from other push-fold calculators. But I think that once you get used to it, it's a really cool way, especially for studying theoretical spots, where you play around with the blind levels and raise sizings. And then usually you will have symmetrical stacks, and you will play around with different villain strategies and see what the maximally exploitative output strategies are, and all the different sub-ranges that make up an overall strategy. And I think that's a great way for getting a feeling for maximally exploitative pre-flop play. But that said, we have already implemented a more standard kind of input style for the multiplayer module, and we will port this to the two-player module as well in the future. Okay, now just for completeness, I'm going to show you how to use this to do pure push-fold calculations, and then I'm going to go over a multiplayer example. So for pure push-fold, you just have the villain only push, maybe something like this. And then you hit calculate, and you get a calling range. These hands here. Okay, let's do a three-player example. So in multiplayer mode, there's one main difference, which is that you can have basic or extended mode on. Basic mode is similar to the strategy tables we saw in two-player mode, and extended mode is a game tree-based input format. The next thing is that it actually makes sense to use awards other than 100-0 in multiplayer mode. So for example, to model the bubble of a 6+ hyper, we'd use 65-35. And then the push-fold calculator will use ICM equities rather than ship EV equities to calculate the EV of each strategy. And then there's no re-raise sizing, because in multiplayer mode, the 3-bet has to be all in. Okay, let's look at an example. We'll keep the awards at 100-0 as they would be in a spin and go. and we'll add a third stack here of 500 chips, and we'll keep the hero in the small blind. Now in basic mode, the input is via strategy tables, just as in the two-player case. So you can click on strategy here, and you get a strategy table. And now you'll immediately notice that the strategy tables in multiplayer mode are much larger than in two-player mode, since position is a factor, right? In two-player mode, there's only one opponent, so position doesn't need to be dealt with. But in multiplayer mode, there's a difference between someone having raised from early position versus someone having raised from late position, etc., etc. And you can also have someone raising and someone else reshoving when the action comes to you, and so on. Now, if you do want to use strategy tables, they are described in detail in the multiplayer help here. But in this example, I'm going to use the extended mode, which is simple to work with, especially if you're a beginner. So in extended mode, basically you get a game tree, and then you fill in ranges for each node in the game tree. And then the program will calculate the hero ranges in the game tree. So we can click get tree here, and we see this tree, all the things that can happen. Button can raise, hero can shove, big blind can call, button can overcall, big blind can fold, and button can call, and so on. And one thing you might want to do when you're looking at specific hands is you might want to specify an action, which will prune the game tree essentially. So we can say, let's look at a situation where we're in a small blind as hero, and the button before us has raised. And we get tree again, and we see it's much smaller because now we know that button raised. So the only questions are, what range should hero shove with, given that big blind calls with a certain range, button overcalls with a certain range, button calls with a certain range, and if hero chooses to fold, the big blind shoves a certain range and the button calls a certain range. So now we need to fill out these ranges. So we'll start with the button raising range, and we say, maybe something like this. Top 42%, maybe top 50%, why not? And then we need to say, given that hero shoves over raise, what is the big blind going to call with? And we're going to say maybe the top 10% of hands, something like this. And then finally, we need to add the button overcall range, which is going to be very tight, presumably, maybe jacks plus, ace king suited, something like that. Then we also have a range where a button raised, hero shoved, big blind folded, and now button can decide to call, and we'll say maybe something like this, maybe not these guys, but let's say ace 8, king queen, maybe something like this, why not? So that's this subtree. And then we also have the instance, which is actually not really relevant when the awards are 100-0, but if ICM was a factor, right, then it would be very important to also get these ranges right, where if hero folds, what does the big blind shove with? Maybe the big blind shoves with something like this. And then what does the button call with? And maybe the button calls a little bit wider in that case. Maybe something like this. So once we filled out all the ranges, we hit calculate, and we get our shoving range. Now this is a 100% range, so every single hand is more profitably played shove than fold. And it's color-coded based on the EVs, but all the EVs are positives. You should shove every single hand, but you'll be much happier shoving queen-queen than jack-6 suited. Let's have a really quick look at how different ranges would change this outcome. So if button were to call much wider, something like this maybe, we hit calculate again. Now we see only these hands are profitable shoves. And in particular, notice that there are some hands now that have negative EV, but since you're in a small blind, folding also has negative EV since you lose your small blind. So these hands should still be shoved. Okay, that's it for the push-fold module. If you have any questions, let us know. And be sure to have a look at the help text up here, which is quite detailed. As for all the other modules, we welcome any suggestions for improvements or requests for features. I hope you enjoyed. Best of luck at the tables. Cheers and goodbye.